I'm Darius Bierman, and this is African Elements. In 2015, Forbes magazine boldly proclaimed Mansa Musa, the ruler of the West African Empire of Mali, to be the wealthiest person ever to have lived on the planet. They estimated his wealth at $400 billion, as compared to Bill Gates' $81.8 billion net worth. Yet barely a century after his famous 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, West Africa had already entered a phase of its history later described in Swahili as the Maafa, or the Great Disaster. How did that happen? How did West Africa, and later the continent, descend from the enormously wealthy kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai into the slave trade and the colonial era within a matter of decades? We'll break down the rise and fall of a continent on the next African Elements. Thank you for watching African Elements, where we're taking Africana studies from the walls of higher education and giving it to the people. I want to give a special thanks to our subscribers and Patreon supporters. This channel runs on people power, so your support is greatly appreciated. As we've seen, Africana Studies was forged largely as a response to widespread misrepresentation of the history of the African continent and people of African descent. The picture of Africa that emerges out of the last 500 or so years since the Atlantic slave trade and the colonial era distorts the understanding of the African history by representing what's essentially a snapshot, as if it were the whole film. The narrative that emerges by focusing narrowly on a 400 or 500 year timeline can be summed up in the words of the famous 19th century German philosopher George Hegel in his reflections on the continent of Africa. It is manifest that want of self-control distinguishes the character of the Negroes. This condition is capable of no development or culture, as we've seen them at this day, such as they have always been. At this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for it's no historical part of the world, it has no movement or development to exhibit. Hegel's comments, taken from lectures that he gave around 1830, reflect a very selective use of timelines, highlighting a moment when Europe was in a state of expansion while simultaneously Africa was in a state of decline. But backing up the timeline to say the 4th and 5th century presents an entirely different narrative. At that time, Rome was declining, and Europe descended into the medieval period of violence, disease, warlordism, and various kingdoms vying for what was left of the crumbling Roman Empire. But while Europe was in tatters, Africa at that moment was thriving. We see vast empires connected to global trade networks that enjoyed wealth and prosperity. If we subjectively decided to start the timeline here, what would be the narrative of Africa as it relates to Europe? Where you start the timeline matters. Nevertheless, the question this video is addressing is, how do we go from Africa before colonialism, with its wealthy and prosperous kingdoms, to Africa that exists at the time of George Hegel's disparaging description? The answer involves a complex chain of events that begins with the development of a global economic system that's centered in Egypt. Egypt sits on an important nexus that linked the Mediterranean to Asia through the Red Sea, and later connected large empires in West Africa to a global trade network through the trans-Saharan trade routes. Because Europe wasn't particularly rich in terms of natural resources, it was predisposed towards expansion. As we saw in our previous video, Why African Culture Matters, the Survival Toolkit, the survival strategies embedded in the culture reveal much about the society and its setting. In the Greek pantheon, we see Ares, god of war, and Poseidon, god of the sea, among others. It reveals a society forged in conflict and expansion. Dominance of the sea was a necessary component, and along with it came the representative deities that accompanied that need. Supremacy over critical access points to Asia would be the driving force for major events in Western Europe for millennia, from the expansion of Greece into North Africa, to the Crusades, and finally the Age of Exploration and Columbus's voyages in 1492. For our story, it's important to note that Alexander III of Macedon extended the Greek Empire into Egypt in 322 BC. And in doing so, Greece gained a major foothold along the spice route that granted them access to India and, by extension, China. When Rome supplanted Greece, Europe's control of North Africa under Rome extended even further. Along with its expansion into North Africa, Rome fortified its trans-Saharan trade routes. In the process, West Africa was more firmly linked into the trans-Saharan network and the global system of trade that eventually extended from West Africa to China. Rome made significant adjustments to its society and culture that fed in part off of critical access points like Egypt. But all that started to crumble with the fall of the Roman Empire around the 5th century AD. By the 7th century, things in Europe took a turn for the worse as another key player arrived on the scene. With the Islamic expansion into North Africa, Western Europe was significantly cut off from its critical lifeline. The centerpiece around which they structured much of their society was jerked right out from under them. That's when things really start to go bad. While Eastern Europe maintained access to the East through Constantinople, in Western Europe, crime rates soared, infant mortality rose to as high as 50%, and malnutrition was rampant. Warlordism was the order of the day, and to top it off, bubonic plague killed up to half of the European population. It was a violent time, but maybe it's the inevitable result of a society that pins its prosperity on a specific set of conditions, and those conditions are jerked out from under them. Keep that in mind for later. In the Trans-Sahara region, Rome's decline left a vacuum that led to West Africa's expansion. When Ghana, the first of 3 major empires in West Africa, began to expand between the 5th and 8th centuries, the centerpiece around which it structured its prosperity was trans-Saharan trade. Ghana's main resource, gold, was traded pound for pound at the same value as salt. Salt is critical in preserving food for long-distance trade, and that's just one example of how West Africa and its society began to pivot around its coveted trans-Saharan trade. Another example was Ghana's adoption of Asian camels that were better suited for long-distance trade than the African variety. Are we seeing a pattern yet? Mali, the second major West African empire, supplanted Ghana in the 13th century. By then, the Islamic caliphates had secured control over North African trade routes, linking the trans-Saharan routes to Egypt. Interestingly, in another adjustment aimed at solidifying access to its lifeline, Mali became the first Islamic empire in West Africa. And that's the stage in which Mansa Musa stepped onto. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali and wealthiest person ever to have existed on earth according to Forbes magazine, undertook a legendary pilgrimage in 1324. His caravan spread so much gold over the Trans-Sahara region on his way to Mecca that it took the city of Cairo over a decade to recover from the inflation. In doing so, he accomplished 2 things. First, he established a demand. His kingdom had more gold than it knew what to do with, but that doesn't do too much good unless you can find people who want it. So his pilgrimage put people on notice by letting everybody know, hey, I've got the goods. Second, he established himself as a prominent player in the trans-Saharan trade, the source of his wealth and the key to his kingdom's prosperity, and yet another egg that West Africa placed in the trans-Saharan trade basket. I sure hope nothing happens to that trans-Saharan trade route. From 1461 to 1591, Songhai, the last of the 3 major West African empires, emerged, but it emerged onto a landscape that was already in the process of shifting. Europe was already encroaching on the Guinea coast, where Portuguese traders already established a foothold. By the fall of Songhai, the Atlantic slave trade was already well underway. Just like that, 1,000 years of wealth and prosperity in West Africa came to an end in just a few decades. What happened? One last critical event that took place far from West Africa was nevertheless critical in the chain of events leading to the Atlantic slave trade: the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople was the Eastern Roman Empire's last gateway to Asia. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Islamic expansion under the Ottomans and became Istanbul. It was the fall of Constantinople that forced Europe to seek alternate routes to Asia, prompting Spain to hire Christopher Columbus in 1492 and prompting the Portuguese to circumnavigate Africa, which it finally did in 1499. As it turns out, to this day, it's much easier to transport goods by ship than it is by train, plane, automobile, or any other method, including camel caravan. When an alternate route to Asia was found, Africa was effectively cut out of the picture, and the trans-Saharan trade fell into disuse. As with Rome, the fundamental assumption on which West Africa had placed its prosperity had been jerked right out from under them, and the results were similar. Various kingdoms vying for supremacy over a crumbling way of life. Just as the medieval period had been in Europe, this was a very violent time in West Africa, in which warring factions came into conflict with one another, captured one another, and sold one another. Africa's decline came at a critical time when Europe was in a state of expansion. Venturing into Asia by sea by circumnavigating Africa, Europe sought to establish ports along the way in order to restock ships and repair sails, and prompting the need to establish colonies. All at a time when Africa was in a state of decline and was ripe for colonization. Here it's important to discuss the role of slavery, not just in West Africa, but in human history. Slavery is as old as human history itself, but historically, slavery has tended to go hand in hand with conquest. Where you find one, you tend to find the other. For example, the Egyptians would conquer their neighbors and make slaves of them. The Greeks conquered their neighbors and made slaves of them. Romans did the same thing. So, as society began to fall apart and West Africa descended into conflict and chaos, the one commodity they had plenty of, the one that goes hand in hand with conflict, happened to be slavery. That also happened to be the very commodity that Portugal was in high demand for at the time. Just as Mali had adjusted to respond to the Islamic-controlled North African trade routes, a similar adjustment took place to meet the Portuguese demand for slaves. Still, I've often heard it asked, how is it that these Africans sold other Africans to Europeans? Two things are important to understand here. First, it's important to understand that traffic in slavery was not a new phenomenon. Along with the expansion and conquest, slaves had been trafficked over the trans-Saharan trade routes for 1,000 years before Europeans arrived on the scene. There's no reason to think that Africans would feel any differently about the trafficking of human beings after Portugal arrived and Europeans needed the one commodity that Africa had plenty of: slaves. Second, it's important to understand that Africans at that time didn't think of themselves as Africans any more than Europeans thought of themselves as Europeans. I've never heard anyone ask the question, how is it that over hundreds of years of conflict between Spain, France, and England that Europeans are killing other Europeans? That's because Europeans thought of themselves as Spanish, French, and English, not as Europeans. In the same way, West Africans thought of themselves not as Africans, but as Igbos, Ashantes, Dahomians, and Yoruban. Even so, as we'll see in a topic for a later video, West Africans did bring elements of their society and culture into the Western Hemisphere, and much of those elements of West African culture are going to help them survive in a different setting. So, as we can see, it was a specific chain of events from Egypt to Greece to Rome, the spread of Islam, and the rise of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, as well as the fall of Constantinople, that led Africa from its wealthy kingdoms to the slave trade and the era of colonization. But was that chain of events inevitable? Could Africa's downfall have been avoided, or is it simply the natural course of events that civilizations rise and fall? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you in the comments.